My name is Bruno Gonçalves. I'm currently a VP for Data Science and Finance at JP Morgan. But all the work I'm going to mention today is actually done before I joined JP Morgan. So nothing I say should reflect on them one way or the other.
Gotcha. And before we get into the deep end of it, I'd love to hear a little bit about your research interests.
So my background is actually in physics and computer science. That being said, my work was always on what people are now calling data science. Even during my PhD many years ago, what I was doing was looking at large data sets, or what for the time were large data sets, order of several gigabytes, of things like Apache web logs, email inboxes, eventually Twitter, large scale router logs, that type of stuff, and use that and apply machine learning and other techniques, and even some concepts from physics itself, to study human behavior, to study how people communicate and people interact with one another. More recently, that work kind of focused on things like computational linguistics, where I was looking at large amounts of Twitter data with geolocation, so that you have basically check-ins with latitudes and longitudes, and essentially looking at the text that people were using and what people were posting on Twitter, and extracting basically information about the language and how the language is being used from one location to the other.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by how the language is used? Is that just, local context, or is it syntactical or semantic? What are the differences you see regionally?
The first project in this was looking at what are the actual languages being used. So you can draw these maps of language borders, language frontiers, where you have areas dominated by one language and the other. So this is particularly prominent in places like Belgium, for example, where one region is French speaking and the other region is Flemish speaking. And you can literally draw the boundary between the two and actually see how the balance between the two languages is changing from one city to the other. And that you see very clearly in Belgium, for example. But if you look at another place like Catalonia, where they use both Spanish and Catalan, there you can see that the languages are much more intermingled. So there isn't a clear boundary. So you have cities, especially larger cities, that attract many more tourists that tend to be dominated by Spanish, while smaller, more rural areas tend to be dominated by Catalan. And from there, we moved on, because I was working at the time with Spanish colleagues, so we were very interested in Spanish. We looked at how Spanish itself changes from one area to the other, with some help of some linguists at the Instituto Cervantes that published a list of synonyms for specific concepts. So like everyday words like car, bus, newspaper, ice cream, that type of word. But they tried to basically list all the possible words that mean that and that somehow represent different branches of the language itself. And based on that, by mapping essentially for each concept what is the dominant word in each location, you can actually build maps of what are the dominant words for each concept. One of the examples I always use is various words for bus. Like one could be bus, one could be autocarro, could be guagua. When you plot them on the map, you clearly see that some areas use predominantly one word versus other areas that use predominantly another word. When you combine the maps from all the different concepts, then you can start finding clusters of areas that tend to use the same kinds of words. And based on those areas, and I can go in more details if you want on how we actually do that, but based on that, you can actually define the boundaries of the different Spanish dialects. And so we find in particular that there is one dialect that basically corresponds to the area in South America that is more or less south of Brazil. Another dialect is more or less the northern part of Brazil, like where Venezuela, Colombia are. And another one would be more like Central America, so Mexico, Guatemala, all those things. And then, of course, continental Spain. And one thing that's very curious is that the boundaries that we find for these dialects actually match very nicely with the old administrative regions of continental Spain. When the Spanish came to America, the king kind of assigned different viceroys, different vice kings to different regions of America that would control those areas. You can actually map very nicely between the dialects we find using these algorithms and the regions that would correspond to each of the different viceroys, which at the time we found was fascinating.
My instinct before you'd mentioned that would have been to think that, so much time has passed. Surely this has, had a melting pot and blended away. Were you surprised to find that result?
Yes, and actually partially you are correct. one of the things we found even before we dug deeper and found these local dialects was actually that there's two kinds of Spanish. There is what we call, let's say, the international Spanish that tends to be spoken in the major cities. So we have this nice map where we basically have a list of all major cities like Mexico City, Lima, Peru, New York City, Los Angeles. So all the major cities in the world with a large Spanish speaking population. And all of those correspond to one single dialect, or what linguists prefer to call super dialects because it's delocalized. And after we remove those, and when we dig deeper in the regions that are, let's say, less urbanized, that's when we find the local dialects. In a sense, what we discovered is that there is this kind of like international Spanish that uses specific words, which we think are coming, like this mixture is coming from tourism, major TV productions, music, all those cultural events. And then the more local areas that still preserve this more historical signature, let's say, of how the language is spoken.
I'm curious about the boundaries you're detecting. I live in Los Angeles, and so I would imagine you would find a pretty, obviously an English-speaking, user base here, but also a strongly Spanish-speaking as well with our proximity
Yes.
to Mexico. Probably stronger in San Diego to my south, and maybe even stronger south of that. Do you find that these borders are a gradient like that, or do they tend to be more of a plateau?
The way we're doing this, we're basically dividing the world in a grid. And each grid cell is a couple of kilometers by a couple of kilometers wide. So they're pretty big cells. So we don't have that much resolution to distinguish, like within a city necessarily, where one ends and the other begins. Also, since we were interested only in Spanish, we were essentially focusing just on tweets in Spanish. So we weren't exactly looking at the boundary between the Spanish and the English as much. So each cell can only belong to one cluster. Okay. So from one cell to the other, in principle, you can have different dialects. There is some geographical continuity, right? So you don't have like a random mixture of the different things, which is one of the checks we made to make sure that the results we were getting were actually sensical. You look at the map and you see, for example, some areas are very blue, blue being one of the colors we're using to represent the dialects. Another area would be very predominantly yellow. Another area would be predominantly green, let's say. And here, when I say area, I mean things the size of a country almost, so large areas on the world map. Of course, there's other things mixed in a little bit. If you zoom in, you might see a little bit more detail, but you see that the overwhelming population, the overwhelming area in that region tend to belong to that cluster.
Thanks to this week's sponsor, Datadog. Datadog is a monitoring platform for cloud-scale applications and architectures. Now, truth be told, I've encountered many people reinventing the wheel when it comes to application performance and metrics and things like that. Especially at startups, you get this kind of quasi side project thing going on that never quite works right, and as the company grows, that system becomes a cancerous annoyance. Why reinvent the wheel? So if you're an application developer, you already know the needs for a product like Datadog. If you're a data scientist, you might not. But if you want to help your organization become data-driven, ask around and find out what they're using or not using today, and see if Datadog is a good solution for you. In addition to monitoring and troubleshooting application performance, a data scientist can also help with the features Datadog provides to unlock novel insights that the business otherwise didn't know about. Now, Datadog has tons of integrations and can go pick up your logs and stuff like that. But you also have the power to instrument your apps if you want to write your own integration. So tool builders and tool users alike can agree on Datadog. If your organization can benefit from more observability of your production systems, learn more and get a 2-week free trial by heading over to dtdg.co/dataskeptic. That's Datadog, no vowels, dtdg.co/dataskeptic. Can you mention some details about the methodology? How do you define the clusters and measure the difference between the dialects in a formal way?
So actually, it was actually surprisingly simple because this is we tried many different things and we ended up settling for the simplest one because we thought it would be the most robust one. So essentially, like I mentioned, we have this grid around the world, and the grid, we're defining it to be more roughly 0.1 degrees latitude versus 0.1 degrees longitude, which of course, so the size of the cells changes a little bit from as you move up in and down in latitude. So essentially what we do is we build this matrix where each row of the matrix is one of these cells, and each column corresponds to one word. And we put a 1 in the cell of the matrix if that word for that concept is dominant in that cell or not, in that grid cell. And based on this, we end up with this big matrix of cells versus words that, in a sense, already lost all the information, all the geographical information. There is no meaning to the sequence of the rows of this matrix, and there is no meaning to the sequence of columns of this matrix. And then essentially what we do is a simple PCA analysis to find what are the principal components, and then we run the k-means algorithm on top of that. When you check for in k-means what is the proper number of clusters, the first division you find is in two clusters, and that gives you one cluster which is the super dialect I mentioned that corresponds very well to the major cities, and then another big cluster that then we further subdivide into 3 or 4 other clusters, and that gives us the local regional areas. And we actually checked to make sure that we were doing this properly. We checked the population of each cell. Because one of the advantages of using this specific grid is that there are projects online, specifically one from the Oak Ridge National Lab, that basically calculates what is the population of the world at the same resolution. So for that same cell, we know exactly how many people are living there. So you can plot the population of each cluster, the distribution of population, the box plots for each cluster, and you can see that the city cluster tends to have much larger populations and much larger population ranges, while the other cluster tends to be much smaller populations, right? So on one side, you see cells with millions of inhabitants, while the other one, you typically have a few tens of thousands or a few hundreds of thousands. Right? So you can make this distinction based on population. And then when you further divide the more rural areas, that's when you identify the local regional dialects.
And as we've been talking, this is based on Twitter data. Could you tell me a few specifics about how you gathered it, the size of the corpora, and things like that?
I've been working with Twitter data for many years now, and I originally started in 2009 collecting data. Back then, it was very easy to just ask them permission to access the data. I was able to accumulate a lot of data since then, and I've been accumulating it continuously until now, basically. I think it was on the order of 10 terabytes of data total, which corresponds to I want to say around 10 billion tweets. From those, of course, I selected the sample, the TED geolocation that were written in Spanish. So that reduced significantly the size of the corpus. But it was still on the order of several tens of millions of tweets with geolocation written in Spanish.
Gotcha. And are you able to look longitudinally? Is this I know language is said to be evolving, and I see that myself. Can you observe that in your data set, or is it too short of a horizon?
In this specific project, we couldn't do that because not only is it too short of an horizon, it's only a few years, but also the popularity of Twitter and basically smartphones, which is how people tweet with geolocation enabled, has increased significantly over time. So the data, if you look at it temporally, it's much denser in recent times than it was a few years ago. Although we were interested in this question also of how the languages are evolving. And we managed actually to find a neat way of looking at that. But this was in a different project looking instead at English. Because for English, not only did we have this geolocated data set from Twitter, but we also had two very nice data sets from Google Books. Google Books was a project from Google a few years ago where they digitalized a few tens of millions of books. And they published for each year, and the year is based on the date of publication of the book, for each type of n-gram, so single words, bigrams, trigrams, 4 grams, and 5 grams, I think, for several different languages. I think it was like 8 different languages. We ended up using only 5. Basically, for each year, for each language, how many times each word or each bigram was used, in how many pages, in how many books. So based on that, we were actually able to create a measure of how the popularity of different words is changing over time. And even more interestingly, the English corpus in Google Books is so large, they actually split it in two. So you have the corpus of books in English published in the US and the corpus of books in English published in the UK. So there you can separate between American English and British English. And you can track it over several hundred years. In the end, we ended up using the period from 1800 until 2010, because that's where the most reliable data was. You have some data going as far back, I want to say, as the 1400s, but then the further back you go, the less reliable it becomes, right? And the spottier it is. And what we did was we created a metric that basically said for each word, for each concept, so we're back to the idea of concepts, you have different ways of saying car, right? You can say car or you can say automobile, for example. One is more American, one is more British. Right? So we created this metric that quantifies for each concept, for each year how British or how American that concept is being represented in this data set. This way, we're also normalizing by different numbers of books over time and all those things. And you could see books published in the US and books published in the UK, both for vocabulary and for spelling, because you can also write things in the British way and write things in the American way. You can see how the mixture is changing. And you see it in particular that it's relatively stable for books published in the UK. The British spell is relatively stable. The British vocabulary is relatively stable. But you see a clear trend for books published in the US of becoming over time more and more Americanized. So becoming closer to what our idea of the American English is over time. And you can actually track, when you look at the plot over time, you can actually track some of the significant changes you see in this temporal evolution to actually historical events that make sense, right? So the biggest departure, for example, where it literally see the kink in the books published in the US towards the American spelling and the American vocabulary is actually when the first Webster dictionary is published, right? Because that's the first time where exactly. So it's the first time where American English kind of becomes systematized, right? And after that, you clearly see a departure from American to British. You also see some other interesting events. You see, for instance, one in the late 80s, which we correlated with basically the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that America somehow became kind of like the dominant power for a few years. Shortly thereafter, you see another spike. We correlate with the first dot-com boom. So it was the first popularization of the internet, which in the beginning was, of course, very much more American-centric than it is now. So that kind of changed things. And no, please.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how linguists have responded to the work. Certainly, they've had similar questions to some of the ones you've been asking, but not necessarily access to the corpus or the computational power you've used. How did they respond to the insights you found?
So actually, they were always very supportive. When we first published the first paper with the Spanish dialects, we were using basically this published list of words, synonyms for concepts. It was published by the Instituto Cervantes, which is basically the Spanish institution that kind of studies Spanish, the Spanish language. Shortly after we posted the paper to the archive, they emailed me and said, "This is great, we love this, but we think you really should have used a different set of words." So they gave us a different list of words, and they invited us to basically rewrite the paper and redo the paper after a year or so with more data and with a different set of words, and publish it in the Linguistics Journal, in the Linguistics Journal of the Iberian Linguistic Society. If I remember correctly, I might be giving it the wrong name, but something like that. So we actually redid the paper a second time with a bigger corpus, with the bigger set of concepts. And we basically found essentially the same results, but more fine-grained. In the original one, I think we had 3 big clusters, which were mapped more or less to the viceroys, but they were kind of merging 2 of them into a single dialect. With the updated data set, we're actually able to split them again and actually get the correct number of clusters. So that was with the Spanish one. And then for the English one, we actually did the work in direct collaboration with linguists. So one of the authors of the paper is a linguist that specializes in the English language. And she guided us and helped us kind of frame the question, make sure we weren't saying anything stupid, quote the right research, etc.
So I'd like to also ask you a somewhat speculative question.
Please.
Language has always kind of been evolving in the ways you've been studying. Personally, I always kind of assumed that had a lot to do with the fact that people were geographically separated and travel was very difficult. So, a person living in the colonies might never have met a person from the Highlands of Scotland. So it would make sense that they wouldn't have a familiarity with the dialect, and people far away, the languages would drift. Do you think that will stop now that we are globally connected, or will we still see a momentum of change?
I'm not sure, and I'm speculating a little bit here. Yeah, but so what I think will happen, and this kind of matches what we're seeing with the English project and even the Spanish project, that on one hand, you will start having this kind of homogeneous background for the language, kind of like the big city dialect of Spanish in a sense. But you're going to start having first small local variations, so little shorthands for saying things that are very, very, very regional, but also that map well to different demographics of society, right? So you will have you're starting to see that now, especially in Twitter, like the younger generation is using the language in a different way and it's creating words in a different way. And that we can observe, but that is no longer as much a geographical phenomenon as it is a demographic one, where a specific sector of society, maybe it's teenagers, maybe African Americans, maybe Latinos, are kind of creating their own language that is no longer geographically distributed, but it's somehow demographically distributed, if that makes sense.
In a similar vein, have you been able to observe the impact of technology on the evolution of language? I could imagine where the corpus used to train an autocorrect could have an unexpected bias on a culture that whose language wasn't included in the training or something along those lines.
Yes. So one of the things we were trying to do that we haven't managed to actually get done properly, or at least as properly as we would want to, was actually to be able to get and to train a spell check that is sensitive to the dialect that you're using. Right. So if I tell you this sentence should be written in the Spanish dialect number 2, let's say, that it adjusts the spelling rules. One of the things other people are doing, and there's even people here at NYU that were working on this, is actually observing how social media is impacting the way language is evolving. And that's kind of where I got some of the ideas of this demographic stratification of language, in a sense.
On Twitter, in addition to what we might call traditional language, we see the use of emoji and hashtags and all sorts of symbolic things. How have those impact research in this area?
I have several colleagues that are working on basically analyzing kind of the dialects of emoji and looking at how emoji are used in different areas. Are they changing from one location to the other? One interesting result I've seen, I don't remember the reference right now, is that, for instance, you tend to see emoji with different skin tones, right? Because now you can add the skin tone information to the emoji or select among different emoji with different skin tones. You actually can correlate the use of that feature with how diverse the local population is, which I thought was very interesting. So it means that people are actually using this feature as a way of self-identification, which I thought was fascinating. Because in the end, I mean, it's an emoji. It's not meant necessarily to be you directly, but people are still using it as a way of showing their identity. So most of the people just use the usual smileys, tear faces. That there are some variations that again tend to correlate. They tend to be more demographic based than geographic based, which for me again points towards this democratization of language and how language is used, and where you can kind of use the language as a way of self-expression and self-identification, not based on just on where you are, but on who your community is.
To wrap up, could you share a few details about the direction your research is headed in?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm doing now, and I'm essentially doing this in my part-time at this point, is to look at the way people mix different languages. So this idea of code switching, how you use Spanish words in English context, etc. I'm still figuring out how to actually train a model to be able to detect this properly. Another thing I think is very interesting, and I'm doing that. I mean, if we go in that direction, we have to spend a lot of time explaining things. But essentially, using word embeddings to automatically detect different meanings for the same word, or how slang or a word is being used in a slangy way to mean something different than what the official meaning is. So, and those are kind of the two things I'm working on these days.
Very neat. Well, I want to encourage listeners to check out your work, especially the maps we were discussing earlier. For whatever reason, maps don't tend to go over well on audio podcasts. Where can people, where can they find your papers and follow your work and some of your speaking gigs that are coming up?
All of my research work you can find on my main website, which is bigoncalves.com. So BGONCALVS.com. And that's basically, you can find the PDFs for all my papers, including the Spanish, English ones, and all of those, with all the illustrations, all the supplementary material, it's all there. If you're interested in following my speaking engagements, you can follow me on Twitter, also at bigoncalves. And I have another website called data4sci.com, so data for science, where I'm listing all my actual speaking engagements. I'll be speaking at Orally AI in New York City this week, and some meetups and other locations at other times. So you can follow everything there.
Outstanding. I'll have links to those resources in the show notes so people can follow up as well. Thanks again for
Excellent.
taking the time to come on the show and share your expertise and research.
Thank you, Kyle. It was a pleasure.